In 1880, Nikolaisen stood on a patch of farmland near the Oslofjord in Norway. He was an archaeologist. The ground beneath his feet was a large mound known locally as the King's Mound. For months, his team had been digging. They carefully removed layers of earth, clay, and stone. What they found was a ship. It was a Viking longship, almost 24 meters long, buried around the year 890 AD. Inside was the tomb of a powerful chieftain. He was buried with his horses, his dogs, and his treasures. Among the wooden shields, the silk fragments, and the iron cauldron, there was something small. It was a game. The board was made of wood, and it was reversible. One side was for a different game, maybe Nine Men's Morris. The other side was for Nefertafaf. The pieces were with it. They were made of horn, turned on a lathe. There were 15 white pieces and 30 dark ones. One piece was larger, more ornate. This was the king, the Nephi. The man buried in the Gokstad ship was a king, or at least a very important leader. He was powerful enough to command this vessel in life. In death, he took his favorite game with him. Nefertafal was not just for passing the time. It was a game of strategy, of a king surrounded by enemies trying to escape. The chieftain in the ship played this game. He understood the feeling of being cornered, of needing a path to safety. The game sat in the dark earth for nearly 1,000 years, waiting. It was a quiet piece of a loud and active life. Number 16, Nefertaf, was a king's last stand on a wooden board. Olav watched his son Bjorn. The boy was 10 years old. His knuckles were white as he gripped a dark horn game piece. As they sat by the long fire in their hall in Vestfold, it was 875 AD. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of roasting meat. Outside, the wind howled, a constant companion in the Norwegian winter. On the carved wooden table between them sat the Nefertafal board. "You are too eager," Olav said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. "You see, my king, and you send all your men at once. A wolf pack is clever. It does not just charge, it surrounds." Bjorn scowled. He looked at the board. His dark pieces, the attackers, were scattered. Olav's white pieces, the defenders, formed a protective shield around the large carved king piece in the center. The king's goal was simple: reach one of the 4 corner squares of the board. Bjorn's goal was also simple: capture the king. To do that, he had to trap the king on 4 sides or pin him against the edge of the board with 3 of his men. "I trapped 3 of your defenders," Bjorn said, pointing to a small pile of white pieces he had taken. A piece was captured when you sandwiched it between 2 of your own. "You took 3 pawns," Olav corrected him. "And in doing so, you opened a path. Look." Olav moved one of his white defenders. It was a subtle move, not an attack. But it created a clear lane. Okay, 2 moves later, his king slid into a corner square. The game was over. Bjorn slumped. He had lost again. He had twice as many pieces as his father, 24 attackers against 12 defenders and a king. It felt unfair, yet he always lost. "This is not about numbers," Olav said, resetting the pieces. The horn felt smooth and cool in his calloused hands. "It is about position. Your men are many, but they are common. My king is one, but he is everything. If he falls, the game ends. My defenders know this. They will die for him. Your men have no one to die for. They only know how to kill." This was the lesson. Nefertafel, the king's table game, was played in every longhouse from Kopong to the distant settlements in the west. Our archaeologists would later find pieces made of whalebone on the Isle of Lewis in Scotland and glass pieces in Birka, Sweden. A board was found scratched into the planking of the Gokstad ship itself, a way for the crew to pass the long hours at sea. It was a game for everyone, but it was a game about kings. Olav tapped the central square, the king's throne. He starts here protected, but he is also trapped. To win, he must move. He must seek the open sea, the edge of the world. He cannot stay in his hall forever. Olav looked at his son. "Your attackers are the sea, the winter, the rival jarls from the next fjord. They are everywhere. They are relentless. You must think like them. Cut off the escape. Block the harbors. Squeeze slowly. Do not just charge." Bjorn set up his pieces again. He placed his Darkhorn warriors in their starting positions along the edges of the board. He looked at the White King, sitting alone and proud in the center. This time he would not be so eager, and he would not hunt the defenders, he would hunt the king, he would think like the winter, he would squeeze. The fire crackled. The game began again. Number 15, Canadelicor was more than just a ball game. The field was a sheet of ice over frozen mud. It lay between two farmsteads in the west of Iceland near Borgarfjordur. The year was 998 AD. On one side stood Egil, son of Skallagrim, and his men. On the other, Gunnar, a local chieftain, and his followers. This was not a friendly match, this was Canadelicor. The game was simple in its objective. Two teams tried to use heavy wooden bats, called natra, to drive a hard leather ball, the notcher, past the opposing team's goal line. But the rules were few. Tackling was allowed, blocking was allowed, wrestling an opponent to the ground to take the ball was allowed. The game often lasted all day, from sunrise to sunset. Egil was in a foul mood. A dispute over a piece of land had been festering for months. The game was suggested at the local assembly as a way to settle things, a test of strength, and without resorting to drawn swords. At least not yet. The ball was thrown into the middle of the field. The clash was immediate. The sound of wood hitting wood echoed across the frozen valley. Men grunted and swore. Gunnar, a large man with a red beard, got the ball first. He scooped it up with his bat and began to run, his men forming a moving wall around him. And Egil intercepted him. He did not go for the ball. He slammed his shoulder into Gunnar's chest. The chieftain went down hard on the ice. The ball skittered away. One of Egil's cousins, a fast runner named Thord, snatched it and began racing toward Gunnar's end of the field. Two of Gunnar's men caught him. One grabbed his arms, the other drove his bat into Thord's legs. Thord yelled in pain as his knee buckled. He was out of the game. This was Canadelicor, as the sagas described it. In Egil's saga, a young Egil gets into a game with other boys. When an older, stronger boy cheats, Egil gets a bat and splits the boy's skull. The game was a reflection of the society that played it tough, competitive, and with a thin line between sport and real violence. Back on the ice, the game grew uglier. Fists were thrown, a man's nose was broken, but the game continued. The ball moved back and forth, a chaotic dance of aggression and endurance. Egil was a force. He was not as young as he used to be, but his strength was legendary. He cleared a path for his team, knocking men down like bowling pins. As the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks, the score was tied. The cold was biting now, and exhaustion was etched on every face. The ball was loose near Egil's goal. Gunnar and Egil both ran for it. They reached it at the same time, their bats clashing. Gunnar was bigger, but Egil was quicker. He twisted, hooked Gunnar's leg with his own and threw him off balance. As Gunnar fell, Egil scooped the ball, turned, and with a final desperate burst of energy, he ran. He ran across the entire field. Men tried to stop him, but they were too slow, too tired. He crossed the goal line as the last light of day faded. His team shouted in victory. Gunnar and his men were silent. They had lost the game. They had lost the argument. Egil had won, not just with skill, but with the same ferocity he applied to everything in his life. He walked off the field bruised and breathing heavily. And it was just a game, but in Iceland in 998 AD, games were never just games. Number 14, fighting was the art of the insult. The Great Hall of Jarl Sigtrygg in Dublin was crowded. It was the winter of 1012 AD. The fires burned high, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. The benches were filled with warriors, their beards still damp with ale. The Jarl sat on his high seat, a gold ring on his arm. This was a night for feasting, for boasts, and for fighting. Fighting was a verbal duel. It was a contest of wit and insult, performed in verse. Two skalds or poets would stand before the hall and trade barbs until one was defeated, either by running out of things to say or by being so thoroughly humiliated that the crowd laughed him into silence. Tonight, the challengers were Brand, the Jarl's own skald, a man known for his sharp tongue, and an Icelandic trader named Halli, who claimed to have a gift for poetry. Brand was confident. He was a professional. Hallie was an amateur. Brand stood up first. He was a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard. He raised his drinking horn. "I see a man from Iceland's shore," he began, his voice ringing through the hall. "Where fish stench is the finest lore. He smells of cod, his hair has lice, his wit is dull as melted ice." The hall chuckled. It was a simple start, but effective. Hallie, a shorter, broader man, smiled. He took a long drink from his own horn before replying. "The Jarl's dog barks. I hear his cry." Hallie's voice was rougher, but clear. "He guards the scraps that fall nearby. He licks the hand that gives him meat, and thinks his rhyming can't be beat. But a dog in a hall, with a collar of leather, is still just a dog in any weather." Now the laughter was louder. Hallie had turned the insult back on Brand, calling him a kept pet. The game was on. The rules of flighting demanded creativity. Simple name-calling was not enough. The insults had to be poetic, using the complex rules of Norse poetry with its alliteration and its kennings. So a kenning was a kind of metaphor, like calling a ship a wave horse or a warrior a feeder of ravens. Brand's face tightened. He launched his next verse. "I am a skald, a shaper of words. You are a dung pile, a feeder of birds. Your mother was a troll who lived in a cave. Your father a thrall, a whipped, beaten slave." This was a serious accusation, an attack on Hallie's lineage. The hall grew quiet. This was the heart of flighting. It was personal, vicious, and public. Hallie did not flinch. He waited a moment, letting the tension build. Then he spoke. "You speak of my mother, you witless wonder. She who rode lightning and commanded the thunder. You say my father was a thrall, so meek? He owned the land on which your ancestors were weak. He sold them for fishhooks and a broken pot, the worthless clan from which you were got." A roar of approval went up from the warriors. Hallie had not only defended his honor, but had claimed superiority. He had taken Brand's insult and made it a weapon against him. This was high-level flighting. Even the Jarl was smiling. Brand tried to recover. He spat out another verse, but it was weak, lacking the cleverness of his earlier lines. He was rattled. Hallie responded with another crushing reply, comparing Brand's poetry to the sound of a sick goat. The contest was over. Brand sat down, his face red with shame. He had been publicly defeated. Hallie raised his horn, and the warriors cheered him. He had won the duel, he had earned respect, and for the rest of the feast, free drinks. Flighting was a dangerous game. It could lead to friendships or to bloody feuds. But for the Vikings, a man's worth was measured not just by the strength of his sword arm, but by the sharpness of his tongue. Number 13 Glima was a dance of strength and balance. The sun was low over the fjord near Trondheim. It was 1025 AD. Two young men, Leif and Care, stood facing each other in a grassy field. They were barefoot. They wore simple leather belts over their trousers. They were preparing to wrestle. This was Glima. Glima was the Norse style of wrestling, and it was different from the brawling scene in other parts of the world. It was not about brute force alone. It was about balance, technique, and using an opponent's momentum against him. An old warrior, Ivar, stood nearby, watching them. He had been the Glima champion of the region for 20 years. Now, he taught the next generation. "Remember," Ivar said, his voice raspy, "the grip is everything. It is the root from which all moves grow." Leif and Care took their grips. In this style called Lazatok, or loose grip, they could grip any part of the opponent's upper body. Their hands locked onto each other's shoulders and arms. They began to circle each other, a constant upright dance. The goal was to throw the opponent to the ground. A throw was only valid if the opponent's torso touched the ground. "You are pushing, Leif," Ivar called out. "You are trying to be a bull. A bull is strong, but a man is clever. Stop pushing. Feel his weight. Feel where he wants to go." Leif was stronger than Care. He was used to winning fights by overpowering his opponents, but Care was faster and had better balance. And he sidestepped Leif's heavy shoves, letting him stumble forward. For several minutes, they strained against each other, neither gaining an advantage. The other young men from the village gathered to watch. Glima was a popular sport, a way to test oneself and gain status without bloodshed. As Kerr suddenly shifted his weight, he pulled Leaf hard, then immediately released the pressure. Leaf, who had been pushing back, lurched forward off balance for just a second. It was all Kerr needed. He dropped low, hooked his leg behind Leif's ankle, and twisted his upper body. It was a classic leg sweep. Leif's feet came out from under him, and he landed flat on his back with a heavy thud. The crowd grunted in appreciation. Kerr had won the first fall. "You see?" Ivar said, walking over to Leif. "He did not throw you. You threw yourself. He just showed you the way to the ground." They reset. This time, Leif was more patient. He remembered Ivar's words. He stopped trying to force a throw. He moved with Kare, feeling the subtle shifts in his balance. He focused on his footwork, staying light on his feet. The sagas were full of stories of great Glima wrestlers. Grettir the Strong was a master. He could defeat men much larger than himself because he understood the principles of leverage and timing. They wrestled for another long minute. Then Leif saw an opening. Kerr attempted a hip throw, trying to get underneath Leif's center of gravity. But Leif was ready. He lowered his own hips, blocking the move. As Kerr was extended and slightly off balance, Leif used his own hip as a fulcrum, grabbed Kerr's belt, and lifted. Kerr's feet left the ground. He sailed over Leif's hip and landed hard. The match was tied. They wrestled one more time to decide the winner. It was a long, grueling bout. Both were exhausted, their bodies slick with sweat. In the end, Leif's superior strength, now guided by technique, won out. He managed to trap Kerr's arm and execute a powerful shoulder throw. Kerr hit the ground. Leif stood over him, breathing heavily. He had won. He helped Kerr to his feet, and they clasped hands. There was no animosity. It was a fair contest. A Glima was not just a fight, it was a discipline. It taught a warrior that strength without cleverness was useless, and that the best way to defeat an enemy was often to let him defeat himself. Our number 12 to fall spill was when a throw of the dice decided everything. The ship was stuck in the harbor at Birka. It was 862 AD. The wind was blowing from the wrong direction, churning the waters of Lake Mälaren. For 3 days, the traders had waited. They were a mix of Sphere, Danes, and a few Rus from the east. They had goods to sell: furs, amber, walrus, ivory, but now all they could do was wait. In the dim light of a warehouse near the docks, a small group of them gathered around an upturned barrel. On it, a game was being played. It was a dice game, a form of tafelspill. The dice were not perfect cubes like modern dice. They were oblong, made from a horse's knucklebone, with numbers carved on 4 sides. The stakes were small pieces of cut silver, called hack silver. Ragnar, a trader from Jutland, shook the dice in his cupped hands. The bone felt light and unpredictable. He needed a high roll. His pile of silver was shrinking. Across from him sat Oleg, a Rus trader with a thick, braided beard. Oleg was having a lucky day. His pile of silver was growing. "The gods favor you today, Oleg," Ragnar grumbled, dropping the dice onto the barrelhead. They tumbled and came to a stop. A low number. A groan went around the small circle of onlookers. Ragnar had lost again. He pushed a few more pieces of silver across the barrel. Dice games were everywhere in the Viking world. Archaeologists have found dice in graves and settlements across Scandinavia and beyond. They were made from bone, antler, or sometimes walrus ivory. They were easy to carry, and the games were easy to learn. It was a perfect way to kill time on long voyages or during bad weather. But it was also more than that. The Vikings had a strong belief in fate, or word. They believed that a person's destiny was woven by the Norns, 3 mythical women who controlled the past, present, and future. A throw of the dice was a small reflection of this. Was it skill? Was it luck? Or was it fate, revealing itself in the fall of the bones? And Oleg picked up the dice. He did not shake them. He simply held them for a moment, then let them drop. A high number, he raked in the silver without a word. Another man joined the game, a local Swede named Sten. He placed a larger stake on the barrel, a small silver arm ring. The game suddenly became more serious. Arm rings were a form of currency, but they were also a sign of wealth and status. The game continued. The pile of silver moved back and forth. Sten was a bold player, betting heavily on each roll. Ragnar played more cautiously, trying to win back his losses, and Oleg remained calm, his face unreadable, his luck holding steady. After an hour, Sten had lost his arm ring to Oleg. He stood up and walked away without a word. He had gambled and lost. That was the way of things. Ragnar was almost out of silver. He decided to risk it all on one last throw. He picked up the dice, he blew on them for luck, a gesture he had seen other gamblers use. He whispered a quick prayer to no god in particular. He tossed the dice. They rolled across the rough wood. Everyone leaned in to see. One die stopped, then the other, a high number, the highest possible. Ragnar let out a whoop of joy. He had won. He scooped up the entire pile of silver, including Oleg's winnings and Sten's arm ring. Oleg just shrugged. Fate had turned. The wind can change direction. So can luck. Outside, someone shouted that the wind was finally shifting. The ships could sail. The game broke up immediately. The traders hurried back to their vessels, the brief diversion forgotten. Ragnar tucked his winnings into his pouch. It had been a good day. He had waited for the wind and played a game of chance. For a Viking trader, the two activities were not so different. Both required patience, a willingness to take risks, and an acceptance of a fate you could not control. Number 11 skid was the winter highway. The snow was deep in the mountains of Telemark. It was a cold, clear day in the year 820 AD. Astrid moved silently through the pine forest. The only sound was the soft hiss of her skis gliding over the fresh powder. She was not skiing for fun. As she was hunting, her skis, her skid, were long and narrow, carved from pine wood. The left ski was longer for gliding. The right ski was shorter for kicking and had a piece of reindeer hide attached to the bottom. The fur's grain allowed her to push forward but kept her from sliding backward when going uphill. In her hand she held a single long pole, which she used for balance and for pushing herself along on flat ground. And this was how people traveled in the north during the long winters. The skis were not a toy, they were a tool, as essential as an axe or a knife. The rock carvings from thousands of years before Astrid's time showed people on skis. The sagas spoke of kings who were praised for their skiing ability. It was a fundamental skill for survival. Astrid had been tracking a large elk for 2 days. She was a skilled hunter, taught by her father. She knew how to read the tracks, how to move quietly, how to survive in the biting cold. The skis made it possible. On foot, she would sink up to her waist in the snow. On skis, she floated on top of it, moving faster than any animal could in these conditions. She came to the edge of a steep slope. The elk's tracks led down into the valley below. Without hesitating, she pointed her skis downhill. She crouched low, using her pole as a rudder to steer between the trees. The wind rushed past her face, stinging her cheeks. For a moment, it felt like flying. This was the joy of skiing, a thrill that even a hunter on a serious mission could appreciate. She reached the bottom of the valley and picked up the trail again. The elk was getting tired. It was not built for deep snow. She knew she was getting close. She moved more slowly now, her bow in her hand, an arrow ready. She found the elk in a small clearing, breathing heavily, its flanks covered in sweat despite the cold. It was a magnificent animal with a huge rack of antlers. It would feed her family for weeks. She raised her bow, took a steadying breath, and let the arrow fly. The shot was true. The elk stumbled and fell. It took her the rest of the day to butcher the animal. She packed the best cuts of meat onto a small sled she had been pulling. The sun was beginning to set, casting a pink glow on the snow-covered peaks. The journey home would be long, and she would be traveling in the dark, but she was not afraid. She had her skis. She strapped the sled's rope around her waist and started the long, steady journey back to her farmstead. The skis hissed on the snow, a familiar, comforting rhythm. They were her connection to this land, her key to surviving its harsh beauty. They were her winter highway, and tonight they were carrying her and her prize home. Skiing was not a sport. It was a way of life, a partnership between a person and the winter, a technique for thriving in a world of snow and ice. Number 10, Halotafall, was the fox and the geese in a longhouse. The storm had been raging for 4 days. It was 930 AD on a small farm in the Orkney Islands. The wind and rain lashed against the turf walls of the longhouse. Inside, it was dark and smoky. Ingrid and her 7-year-old daughter Solveig sat on a bench near the fire. There was no work to be done outside. The sheep were huddled in their pen. The men were mending nets in the barn. "I am bored," Solveig said, for the 10th time that day. Ingrid sighed. She looked around for something to do. Her eyes fell on a flat, smooth stone they used for grinding grain. She picked it up and took a piece of charcoal from the fire. On the stone, she drew a cross-shaped pattern of lines. This was the board for Halotafall, or the fox game. "Find me 13 small white stones," Ingrid told her daughter, "and 1 black one." Solveig scampered off. She returned with a handful of pebbles from a pouch where she kept her treasures. She picked out the best ones, 13 white ones for the geese, and 1 dark, shiny one for the fox. The game was ancient and simple, a game of asymmetrical strategy. It was a game of hunter and hunted. Ingrid placed the single black stone, the fox, in the center of the board. Solveig arranged her 13 white stones, the geese, on one side of the cross. "Your geese want to trap my fox," Ingrid explained, though Solveig already knew the rules. "They want to corner him so he cannot move. My fox wants to eat your geese. If he can do that, he wins." The geese could only move forward or sideways 1 space at a time. The fox could move in any direction. The fox could eat a goose by jumping over it to an empty space beyond, just like in checkers. The geese could not jump. Solveig went first. She moved one of her geese forward. It was a slow, creeping advance. The gaggle of geese began to fill the board, trying to build a wall to contain the fox. Ingrid moved her fox, testing the line, looking for a weakness. This was a quiet game, a game of thought. It did not have the high stakes of a dice game or the complexity of Nefatafall. It was a game for a winter afternoon, a way to sharpen the mind. Variations of this game were played all over the world, but for Ingrid and Solveig, it was their game, a small ritual to pass the endless hours of a North Atlantic storm. Boards for similar TAF or table games have been found scratched on stones and wood in Viking sites everywhere. Solveig was a clever player for her age. She managed to build a solid line of geese, pushing the fox back. But Ingrid was more experienced. She sacrificed one of her own imaginary geese to create a gap. She let Solveig jump one of her pieces, which looked like a victory for the geese. But it opened up a path. Ingrid's fox darted into the space. On her next move, she jumped one of Solveig's geese. The white pebble was removed from the board. Then she jumped another, and another. Soon, there were gaps all through the geese's formation. The fox ran free, picking them off one by one. Solveig frowned. "You tricked me." "The fox is a trickster," Ingrid said gently. "It does not fight the whole flock at once. It looks for the one that has strayed from the others. It creates confusion." They played again. This time, Solveig was more careful. She kept her geese together. She did not fall for Ingrid's tricks. The game took a long time. The line of geese slowly, painstakingly pushed the fox into a corner of the board. Finally, the fox was surrounded. It had no more moves. Solveig had won. She beamed with pride. Ingrid smiled and ruffled her hair. Outside, the storm continued to howl, but inside the longhouse, a mother and daughter had created their own small world of strategy and cunning, a world of a fox and his geese on a simple stone board. Number 9, Hestavig, was a brutal spectacle. The air at the local assembly, the Thing, was thick with anticipation. It was a summer day in Iceland around 1055 AD. Farmers and chieftains from all over the region had gathered to settle legal disputes, arrange marriages, and trade goods. But now, the legal talk was over. It was time for the entertainment. It was time for Hestavig, horse fighting. 2 stallions were led into a large fenced-off field. One was a powerful gray owned by a farmer named Flosi. The other was a fiery black, owned by his neighbor Gunnar. The 2 men did not like each other. A long-running argument over grazing rights had made them bitter rivals. This fight was as much about them as it was about their horses. The stallions were bred for aggression. They were not workhorses, they were prized for their fighting spirit. The mares were led around the edge of the enclosure to agitate the stallions, to make them more eager to prove their dominance. The rules were simple. The 2 horses were brought face to face. Their owners stood beside them, each holding a long goading stick. The goal was to make the other horse run away or be so badly injured it could no longer fight. The fight began. The horses screamed and lunged at each other, biting at necks and shoulders, kicking with their powerful back legs. The crowd roared. Bets were being shouted, silver and goods wagered on the outcome. Flosi and Gunnar urged their animals on, poking them with the sticks, directing their attacks. This was not just a fight between 2 animals, it was a contest of skill for the owners as well. A good handler knew how to provoke his horse without making it panic, how to spot a weakness in the opponent. The black stallion, Gunnar's horse, was more aggressive. It reared up and came down with its front hooves on the gray's back. The gray staggered but did not fall. Flosi, seeing his horse in trouble, jabbed it in the flank, driving it forward, away from the attack. The gray spun around and bit deep into the black horse's leg. The fight was brutal and bloody. Both horses were covered in bites and scrapes. This was a common and popular form of entertainment in the Viking Age, particularly in Iceland. The sagas like Ingjald's Saga contain detailed accounts of horse fights. These events were major social gatherings, but they often ended in real fights between the owners. The passions stirred by the animal combat could easily spill over into human violence. Gunnar's black stallion was starting to tire. It was breathing heavily, its attacks becoming less frequent. Flosi's gray, though more injured, seemed to have more stamina. Flosi saw his chance. He maneuvered his horse to the side, and with a sharp command and a poke of his stick, encouraged a powerful kick. The gray's hoof caught the black stallion high on its back leg. There was a sickening crack. The black horse screamed in pain and collapsed. The fight was over. A silence fell over the crowd. Gunnar stared at his injured horse, his face pale with fury. He had not just lost the fight, he had lost a valuable animal. His honor was shamed. He turned to Flosi, his hand moving to the hilt of the Sikhs at his belt. "You cheated," Gunnar yelled. "Your stick was sharpened." Flosi stood his ground. "My horse was better. You are a sore loser." Friends of both men quickly stepped between them. A brawl at the Thing was a serious matter. They were separated, shouting threats at each other. The dispute over grazing rights had not been settled. It had been made 10 times worse. The horse fight, meant to be a release of tension, had only created more. It was a brutal spectacle for a brutal time, a pastime where the line between sport and conflict was perilously thin. Number 8, Merrill's was the mill game, scratched in stone. Brother Aidan shivered in the damp cell. It was the year 815 AD on the holy island of Iona, off the coast of Scotland. The monastery was still being rebuilt after the last raid by the Northmen 9 years earlier. The scars were everywhere. Burned timbers, missing treasures, and the ghosts of the monks who had been slaughtered on the beach. Among the few survivors was a Norseman named Finn. He had been captured during the raid, a young warrior left for dead. The abbot, in his Christian mercy, had spared him. Now Finn was a thrall, a servant doing manual labor around the monastery. He was quiet and worked hard, but the monks were still afraid of him. He was a heathen, one of the sea wolves. Aidan saw Finn one afternoon sitting by himself behind the new chapel. He was scratching lines in a flat piece of slate with a sharp stone. Aidan watched from a distance. Finn drew a square, with lines connecting the middles of each side, and diagonals connecting the corners. It was a board for a game. He had two small piles of pebbles, 9 black and 9 white. He was playing against himself. The game was Morels, or Nine Men's Morris. Aiden had seen a version of it played by Roman soldiers stationed at the Great Wall to the south long ago. The game was ancient, played for thousands of years in places as far away as Egypt and China. It was a game of pure strategy. Aiden walked over. Finn looked up, his eyes wary. He was a boy, no older than 20. What is that game? And Aiden asked in his broken Norse. Finn grunted. Merrills, he said. He pointed to the board. You have 9 men. You try to get 3 in a row. A mill. The rules were simple. The players took turns placing their pieces on the intersections of the lines. If a player formed a row of 3, a mill, they could remove one of their opponent's pieces from the board. Once all the pieces were placed, players moved them one space at a time along the lines, still trying to form mills. The game was won when an opponent was reduced to 2 pieces, or was blocked from making any legal moves. Aiden sat down. Show me. They played. Finn used the black stones, Aiden the white. Finn was a much better player. He thought several moves ahead. He set traps, forcing Aiden to block one potential mill while he completed another one on the other side of the board. He quickly captured 3 of Aiden's pieces. Aiden was fascinated. The game was like a logical puzzle. It was elegant and deep. It required no luck, only skill. It was a stark contrast to the violent, chaotic world Finn came from. Or so Aiden thought. Where did you learn this? Aiden asked. My father, Finn said. We played on the ship, scratched a board on a chest, used fish vertebrae for pieces. Aiden realized that this simple, peaceful game of strategy was just as much a part of Finn's world as the axe and the longship. The Vikings were not just mindless raiders. They were people who got bored on long voyages, who had families, who played games with their children. A board for Nine Men's Morris was even found carved into a stone at a Viking settlement in Greenland, a pastime at the very edge of the known world. But they finished the game. Finn won easily. He had reduced Aiden to just 2 pebbles. He looked at the monk, a flicker of a smile on his face. For a few minutes, they had not been a monk and a heathen, a captor and a captive. They had just been 2 men playing a game. Finn stood up to go back to his work. Aiden stayed, looking at the scratched lines on the slate. It was a universal language, a small piece of common ground in a divided and violent world. The game of Merrills played in Roman forts, Egyptian temples, and on the decks of Viking longships was a quiet thread connecting them all. Number 7, Ilensk Skak was a slower, stranger game. In 1831, a farmer named Malcolm MacLeod was walking on a sandy beach on the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. He saw something buried in a sand dune. When he dug it out, he found a small stone chamber. Inside was a treasure. Yes, it was a hoard of 93 carved game pieces. They were chessmen, but they were unlike any chessmen he had ever seen. The pieces were carved from walrus ivory and whale teeth. The kings and queens sat on ornate thrones, their faces full of worry and sorrow. The bishops were stern figures with croziers. The knights were mounted on small, sturdy horses. But the strangest pieces were the rooks. Instead of towers, they were wild-eyed warriors biting the tops of their shields. They were berserkers. These were the Lewis chessmen. Scholars would later determine they were likely made in Trondheim, Norway, around 1150 to 1200 AD. They were the possessions of a wealthy Norse merchant or chieftain hidden or lost on a journey. They're one of the most famous archaeological finds from the Viking Age, and they give us a glimpse into the Norse version of chess, sometimes called Islensk Skak or Icelandic chess. The Vikings did not invent chess. The game came from India, through Persia and the Arab world, and into Europe. But like everything else they encountered, the Vikings adapted it and made it their own. The Berserker Rook is the most obvious example. It was a character from their own culture, a warrior they understood. Let's imagine a scene. It is 1180 AD in a chieftain's hall near modern-day Trondheim. 2 men, Hakon and Magnus, are playing with a set of chessmen, just like the ones found on Lewis. The board is set up. The rules are slightly different from modern chess. The pawns, on their first move, could only advance one square, not two. This made the opening of the game much slower, more methodical. The queen was a much weaker piece. She could only move one square diagonally in any direction. She was not the powerful, board-dominating force she is today. The bishop could also only move a few squares and could jump over other pieces. The game between Håkon and Magnus was a long, grinding affair. It was a battle of position, of slowly building up pressure. There were no quick, devastating attacks. It was more like a siege than a pitched battle. Håkon, playing with the white pieces, focused his attack on the king side. He advanced his knight and his berserker rook. Magnus responded by building a solid wall of pawns. The game was a test of patience. The saga sometimes mentions skak, and it was considered a noble pastime, a game for intelligent and strategic minds. It was a sign of a good education. King Canute the Great was said to be an avid player. After 2 hours of play, the board was a complex knot of pieces. Magnus made a small mistake. He moved his bishop to attack Håkon's queen, but he overlooked a counterattack. Håkon's knight, which had been sitting quietly on the edge of the board, suddenly sprang to life. It forked Magnus's king and his berserker rook. Magnus swore under his breath he had to move his king. On the next turn, Håkon captured the berserker. The loss of the powerful piece was a major blow. From there, Håkon slowly, carefully dismantled Magnus's defenses. The game ended not with a dramatic checkmate, but with Magnus resigning, his position hopeless. The Lewis chessmen show us a different side of the Vikings. They were not just warriors, they were craftsmen of incredible skill. They were not just raiders, they were part of a wider European culture, adopting and adapting games like chess. And the game they played reflected their world. It was slower, tougher, and populated by kings, queens, and wild-eyed berserkers biting their shields in a battle fury. Number 6. Songleikur was the sound of a longhouse. The air in the small turf house was heavy with the smell of burning seal oil. It was a long night in the western settlement of Greenland around the year 1080 AD. Outside, the wind howled, a relentless, soul-chilling sound. It was the sound of isolation. They were farmers and hunters living at the very edge of the world. Inside, about 15 people were gathered. They were the family and farmhands of Ketil, the owner of the steading. After the meager evening meal of dried fish and seal meat, there was little to do but wait for the morning. The darkness of the Greenland winter was absolute, but tonight was different. An old man named Bjarni had picked up his instrument. It was a talharpa, a type of bowed lyre. It had a shallow wooden bowl for a body with a piece of sheepskin stretched over the top. A simple wooden neck protruded from the body, and it had 4 strings made of twisted horsehair. Bjarni held the instrument on his lap and drew a curved bow, also strung with horsehair across the strings. The sound that came out was not sweet or refined. It was a raw, melancholic drone. It was the sound of the wind, of the sea, of the vast, empty landscape outside. It was the sound of their lives. Bjarni began to sing. His voice was old and cracked, but it was strong. He did not sing of love or happiness. He sang one of the old stories, a lay from the Poetic Edda. He sang of the god Odin, who hung himself from the world tree for 9 days and 9 nights to learn the secrets of the rune. He sang of the great wolf Fenrir, who would one day break his chains and devour the sun. This was Songleikur, the song play. It was music and storytelling combined. This was how history was passed down. These people had no books. Their culture, their religion, their laws, their family histories, it was all held in the memory of the storyteller and in the verses of the old poems. The children sat closest to the fire, their eyes wide. They had heard the stories before, but each telling was a new experience. Bjarni changed the words slightly, added a new detail, or sang with a different emotion. He was not just reciting, he was performing. The adults listened, their hands busy with small tasks. The women were spinning wool. The men were sharpening knives or mending leather straps. The music and the story filled the small house, pushing back the darkness and the cold. It reminded them of who they were. It connected them to their ancestors back in Iceland and Norway, people they had never met who had listened to these same stories in their own longhouses. Archaeologists have found fragments of musical instruments in Viking graves, panpipes in York, a lyre-like instrument from the Sutton Hoo burial, though Anglo-Saxon. It shows the type of instruments present, and bridges for stringed instruments in Scandinavian settlements. The music was a part of life. Bjarni sang for over an hour. He told the whole story of Ragnarok, the final battle of the gods. He sang of the deaths of Thor and Odin, of the world being consumed by fire and water, but he ended on a note of hope. He sang of the new world that would rise from the sea green and fertile, and of the few gods who would survive to start over. When he finished, the room was silent, except for the crackling of the lamp and the howl of the wind. The story was over. The spell was broken. But for a little while, the small turf house in Greenland had not been a lonely outpost. It had been a stage, a library, a temple. It had been filled with gods and giants, heroes and monsters. The sound of the Talharpa and the old man's voice had kept the darkness at bay. Number 5, Talguknifr was art in a calloused hand. The longship rolled on the grey swells of the North Sea. It was 910 AD. They had been at sea for a week, sailing from Norway to the Danelaw in England. The wind was steady, the sail was full, but the journey was monotonous. There was nothing to see but endless water and a sky the color of slate. Einar sat on his sea chest, his back against the side of the ship. The spray was cold on his face. He was a farmer and a part-time warrior like most of the men on the ship. He was strong and he knew how to handle an axe. But he was also patient, and his hands were clever. He pulled out his Talguknifr, his carving knife. It was a small, simple knife, but the blade was sharp. From a leather pouch, he took a piece of driftwood he had found on the shore before they left. It was a twisted, gnarled piece of wood, but Einar saw a shape in it. He began to carve. His hands were rough and calloused from years of farm work and rowing, but his movements with the knife were precise. He shaved off thin curls of wood. Slowly, an animal began to emerge from the block. It was a dragon, its neck long and curved, its mouth open in a silent roar. This was not a job. He was not being paid to do this. This was a pastime, a way to fill the empty hours of the voyage. Carving was a common skill among Norsemen. Their world was made of wood, their houses, their ships, their tools. They understood wood, and they knew how to shape it. The incredible, intricate carvings found on the Oseberg ship, from animal head posts to the sleighs and carts, show the level of mastery these people achieved. But even an ordinary man like Einar could create something beautiful. Another man, Olaf, came and sat next to him. "What are you making, Einar? A gift for my son," Einar said, not looking up from his work. A toy. He worked on the fine details. He carved scales onto the dragon's back. He gave it sharp, pointed teeth. He used the tip of his knife to give the eye a fierce expression. The other men on the ship were gambling with dice, or sleeping, or telling stories. Einar was quiet, lost in his small act of creation. The carving was more than just a toy, it was a piece of his world. The dragon was a powerful symbol, a creature of myth and legend. It was the same shape that was carved into the prow of their longship, meant to strike fear into their enemies and protect the crew from sea monsters. By carving this shape, Einar was connecting with the beliefs and the art of his people. After a few hours, he was finished. The dragon was small enough to fit in the palm of his hand, but it was full of life and energy. He ran his thumb over the smooth, carved wood. He had taken a worthless piece of driftwood and given it a spirit. He tucked the small dragon back into his pouch. They would be in England in a few days. There might be trading, or there might be fighting. The future was uncertain. But in the middle of the vast, empty sea, Einar had spent his time not in idleness, but in making something. He had used his hands and his knife to create a small piece of art, a link to his home and his family. For a Viking sailor, this simple pastime was a way to stay grounded, to hold onto a piece of his identity in a world of constant motion and change. Number 4, Sund was a test of lungs and will. The water of the fjord was shockingly cold, even in late summer. It was 970 AD, near the court of a Norwegian jarl. Two young warriors, Harold and Bjorn, swam side by side, their powerful strokes cutting through the dark water. This was not a friendly swim, this was a contest. Swimming, or sund, was a highly valued skill among the Vikings. The sagas are filled with stories of heroes who were great swimmers. The future king of Norway, Olaf Tryggvason, was said to be able to swim and climb cliffs better than any man. Swimming was a practical skill for a seafaring people. If you fell off a ship, it could save your life. But it was also a competitive sport, a way to prove strength, endurance, and courage, and these contests were often brutal. Harold and Bjorn were rivals. Both were trying to win the favor of the Jarl to become one of his trusted housecarls. The Jarl himself was watching from the shore along with the rest of his court. They reached the middle of the fjord. They were far from shore. "Are you tired yet, Bjorn?" Harold shouted, a grin on his face. "My grandmother could swim faster than you?" Bjorn shouted back. Then the nature of the contest changed. Harold suddenly dove underwater. Bjorn, knowing what was coming, took a deep breath and did the same. Underwater, it was a silent, blurry struggle. Harold grabbed Bjorn and tried to hold him down. Bjorn kicked and twisted, trying to break free. It was a test of who could hold their breath longer, who was stronger in the cold, disorienting depths. This was a common part of Norse swimming contests. The goal was not just to race, but to try and drown your opponent. Egil's saga describes a swimming match where Egil holds his opponent underwater until the man nearly dies. Bjorn's lungs were burning, he was a strong swimmer, but Harold was like a seal in the water. Bjorn managed to push Harold away and shot to the surface, gasping for air. A moment later, Harold surfaced, laughing. "Jetting tired!" Harold taunted. They swam on. A few minutes later, Bjorn was the one who initiated the underwater fight. This time he was more prepared. He got a better grip on Harold, wrapping his legs around his rival's waist. They sank into the cold darkness. They tumbled and wrestled a chaotic underwater Glima match. This time it was Harold who had to break away first. They were both exhausted. The cold was seeping into their bones, making their muscles slow and heavy. Their friendly rivalry was turning into a genuine, desperate struggle for dominance. The Jarl watched from the shore, his face impassive. He was not just watching a sport, he was judging these young men. He was looking for more than just strength. He was looking for stamina, for cunning, for the will to win. Even when exhausted and in pain, these were the qualities he needed in a warrior. Harald and Bjorn swam back towards the shore, side by side. The underwater wrestling was over. Now it was a pure race, a test of what little energy they had left. They swam with a grim determination, their arms and legs aching with every stroke. They reached the shallows at the same time, stumbling out of the water, collapsing onto the rocky beach, gasping for air. They were too tired to even look at each other. The Jarl walked down to them. "It is a draw," he declared. "You are both strong, but strength is common. The will to continue when you are certain you will fail. That is rare. You both have it." He looked from one young man to the other. "You will both have a place in my hall." Harold and Bjorn looked at each other. A smile of mutual respect broke through their exhaustion. They had tested each other to the absolute limit and had both been found worthy. The cold water of the fjord had been their proving ground. Number 3 Skinliker was a painful tug-of-war. The Yule feast had been going on for 3 days. The Jarl's longhouse was hot, crowded, and loud. The air was thick with the smell of ale, sweat, and wood smoke. The warriors had eaten their fill of roasted pig and were now deep into their cups, telling loud stories and boasting of their exploits. Eventually, the boasts turned to challenges. An old warrior, half-drunk, staggered to his feet. "Enough talk," he roared. "Let's see some strength. Who is ready for Skinliker?" A cheer went up. Skinliker, the skin-pulling game, was a favorite pastime at feasts. It was a simple, raw test of strength. A large, tough piece of animal hide, usually from a cow or a seal, was brought into the center of the hall. 2 challengers stepped forward. The first was Sven, a young warrior, eager to make a name for himself. He was tall and muscled, his arms thick from years of rowing. His opponent was Rolf, an older, more experienced raider. Rolf was not as tall as Sven, but he was broader, with a low center of gravity and hands like stone hammers. As they sat on the floor, facing each other, they pressed the soles of their feet together. They each took a firm grip on the animal hide. The objective was simple: pull the other man up from the floor. The Jarl gave a signal. The contest began. Nothing happened. For a full minute, the two men strained, their muscles bulging, their faces turning red. The hide was stretched taut between them, groaning under the pressure. The only sounds were the grunts of the two men and the excited shouts of the onlookers. This was not a game of technique or skill. It was a contest of pure brute force. It was about who had the stronger back, the more powerful legs, the more determined grip. Sven pulled with all his might. He was younger, and he thought he could overwhelm Rolf with a sudden burst of power. But Rolf did not budge. He was rooted to the floor like an old oak tree. The older warrior let Sven waste his energy. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Rolf began to pull. It was a steady, relentless pressure. Sven felt his grip start to slip. The rough hide was scraping the skin from his palms. He gritted his teeth and held on. He could feel his backside starting to lift from the floorboards. The crowd roared louder, sensing a winner. Sven's friends shouted encouragement. Rolf's companions banged their drinking horns on the tables. Sven's arms were on fire. His back felt like it was about to break. He could not hold on any longer. With a final, desperate grunt, Rolf gave one last mighty heave. Sven was pulled clean off the floor, landing in a heap in front of his opponent. When Rolf had won, he let go of the hide and stood up, raising his arms in victory. He had proven once again that age and experience could triumph over youthful exuberance. Sven sat on the floor, looking at his raw, bleeding hands. He had lost, but he had lost to a strong opponent in a fair contest. He got to his feet and clasped Rolf's arm in a sign of respect. The skinliker was over. Another cask of ale was opened. The boasting and storytelling resumed. It was a simple, painful, and effective way to settle arguments about who was the strongest man in the hall, at least until the next feast. Number 2, Bean Scoutar were for gliding on frozen rivers. The river that ran past the town of Hedeby was frozen solid. It was January in the year 950 AD. The trading town, one of the largest in the Viking world, was quiet under a blanket of snow. The ships were pulled up on shore, their sailing season over until the spring, but the frozen river was not empty. It was filled with children. They were skating, but they were not using modern metal-bladed skates. They were using Bane Scoutar bone skates. A young boy named Eric sat on the riverbank tying his skates on. They were simple things. The blades were made from the polished leg bones of a horse, flattened on the bottom. Each bone had holes drilled in it, and leather thongs were threaded through the holes. Eric wrapped the thongs tightly around his leather shoes. He stood up, a little wobbly at first. He walked carefully onto the ice. The bone skates did not have sharp edges like modern skates. You could not push off with your feet to gain speed. To move, you needed poles. Eric held a long wooden pole in each hand, with a sharp iron point at the end. He pushed off with his poles, digging the points into the ice. He began to glide. He was not fast or graceful, but he was moving. He joined the other children who were racing and sliding across the frozen river. It was a scene of pure, simple fun. Archaeologists have found hundreds of these bone skates all over Northern Europe, in places like Birka in Sweden, York in England, and of course Hedeby in Denmark. They were a common part of winter life. For adults, they were a practical way to travel over frozen lakes and rivers faster than walking through deep snow. A man could go ice fishing or visit a neighboring village on his skates. But for children like Eric, they were a source of endless entertainment. He and his friends had a game. They would race from one end of the town's frozen harbor to the other. There were no rules except to get there first. Eric pushed hard with his poles, his arms pumping. He glided past his friend Lars. He was in the lead. The cold air burned his lungs. He could see the finish line, an old boat stuck in the ice. Suddenly, another boy, Carl, came up beside him. Carl was bigger and stronger. He gave Eric a hard shove, and Eric lost his balance and went sprawling onto the ice. His head hit the frozen surface with a loud crack. For a moment he saw stars. Carl glided past, laughing, and won the race. Eric sat up, his head throbbing. His friends helped him to his feet. There was no real malice in Carl's shove. It was just rough play, the way boys had always played. And Eric was more embarrassed than hurt. He picked up his poles and skated slowly back to the riverbank. His head hurt, but he would be fine. He sat down and untied his skates. The polished bone felt smooth in his hand. It was a simple tool made from the remains of an animal, but it had given him an afternoon of freedom and speed, a way to fly across the frozen world. He would be back tomorrow for another race, and this time he would be ready for Carl's shove. Number 1, lifting was the measure of a man. The farm was on the southern coast of Iceland. The year was 1010 AD. A young man named Orm stood in front of a large gray stone. It sat on the ground near the longhouse. This was the farm's lifting, or lifting stone. Every farm of any importance had one. Orm was 18 years old. He had spent his life working on this farm, growing strong on hard labor and simple food. Now he wanted to leave. He wanted to join the crew of a trading ship that was sailing for Ireland in the spring. But the ship's captain, a man named Thorir, would not take just anyone. He only wanted strong men, men who could handle a heavy oar for weeks on end. The test was simple. Orm had to lift the stone. These lifting stones were a rite of passage. They were a public measure of a man's strength. There were different grades of stones. A halfstyrkur, or half-strong stone, was one that a man could lift to his knees. A fullstyrkur, or full-strong, stone was one he could lift to his waist and place on a ledge. Thor's ship was a long-haul vessel. He required his crew to be full strong. Orm's father, his brothers, and Thorir, the ship's captain, were all watching. Orm took a deep breath. He had been practicing in secret lifting smaller rocks. But this stone was different. That it had a history. His father had lifted it as a young man. His grandfather had lifted it. It was a part of the family's honor. He bent his knees and wrapped his arms around the cold, rough stone. He found the best grip he could. He pulled. The stone did not move. It felt like it was part of the earth itself. The captain, Thorir, watched with his arms crossed, his expression neutral. Orm took another breath. He focused. He remembered his father's advice. "It is not your arms that lift it," he had said. "It is your legs and your back. Lift with your whole body." He tried again. He drove his feet into the ground. He straightened his legs using their power. The stone shifted. It scraped against the dirt. It was off the ground. He had it. He strained, his back screaming in protest, and brought the stone up to his knees. He stood there for a moment, trembling with the effort, the heavy weight resting on his thighs. He had achieved half strong, but that was not enough. The ledge was waist high. It seemed a mile away. He knew he had only one chance. He would not have the strength to try again. He took one more deep, ragged breath. He heaved the stone upwards, using every last ounce of his strength. The stone rose. For a terrible second, he thought he was going to drop it. But he managed to roll it onto the ledge. It settled with a heavy, final thud. Orm staggered back, his body screaming with a mixture of pain and relief. He had done it. His father clapped him on the shoulder. Thorir, the captain, allowed a small smile. "You are strong enough," he said. "You have a place on my ship." Orm felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with vanity. He had not just lifted a rock. He had proven himself. He had met the standards set by his ancestors. He had earned his place in the world of men. The lifting stone was not a game. There was no fun in it. It was a test, a qualification, a simple and honest measure of a man's worth in a world where strength was not a hobby, but a necessity for survival.